To understand the Burma Campaign, one must first understand the silence. It was not a true silence, of course. The jungle is never truly quiet. It is a living, breathing entity, a cacophony of insects, the rustle of dry leaves under the weight of unseen creatures, and the rhythmic dripping of water from the high canopy to the fern-covered floor. But to the soldiers arriving there in the early months of 1942, fresh from the open deserts of North Africa or the manicured training grounds of England, the jungle felt suffocatingly silent. It was a green wall that absorbed sound, light, and hope with equal indifference. This was a theater of war unlike any other in World War II, a place where the environment itself killed more men than bullets ever could. This is the story of the long struggle in the Far East, a campaign often called the Forgotten War, fought in a place where modern mechanized warfare went to die. Picture the geography. Burma acts as a massive, rugged door between India and Southeast Asia. It is defined by great north-south river valleys, the Irrawaddy, the Chindwan, the Sidang, separated by steep, jungle-clad mountain ranges that defy easy passage. In 1942, there were almost no roads crossing these mountains from India into Burma. It was a natural fortress, but for the British Empire, it was a fortress that had been left unguarded, the back door to the jewel in the crown, India. When the Japanese Empire launched its offensive, they did not just bring soldiers. They brought a new kind of warfare, one of speed, infiltration, and psychological terror that the defenders were wholly unprepared to meet. The story begins in earnest in the dry season of early 1942. The Japanese 15th Army, flush with victory from their rapid conquests in Malaya and Singapore, crossed into southern Burma. Their objective was Rangoon, the vital port city that served as the lifeline for supplies going north to China. The British forces, known as the Army in Burma, were a patchwork mix of British, Indian, and Burmese units, under-equipped and under-trained for the terrain. They were road-bound. Their doctrine relied on trucks, artillery, and established supply lines. They looked at the map and saw roads as the only arteries of movement. The Japanese looked at the same map and saw the jungle as a highway. As the Japanese advanced, they employed a tactic that would become their hallmark, the hook. While a small force would engage the British frontally on the road, the main Japanese body would move silently through the dense jungle on the flanks, bypassing the defenders and emerging behind them to establish a roadblock. Suddenly, the British forces would find themselves cut off, their supplies severed, panic setting in as they realized the enemy was not just in front of them, but all around them. This happened time and again. The defenders would establish a line, the Japanese would hook around it, and the British would be forced to retreat to avoid encirclement. It was a demoralizing rhythm of hold, buckle, and run. The soldiers on the ground began to feel a deep, pervasive sense of claustrophobia. In the European theater, a soldier could see the enemy across a field. Here, visibility was often measured in yards, sometimes feet. A patrol could walk right past a hidden Japanese sniper tied into the branches of a teak tree without knowing it, until the crack of a rifle broke the heavy air. The Japanese troops were light infantry in the truest sense. They traveled with minimal gear, often carrying rice rations in socks slung around their necks, moving on bicycles or on foot, unburdened by the heavy logistical tail that anchored the British to the few paved roads. They knew how to use the jungle, how to navigate the bamboo thickets, and how to use the night. By February 1942, the situation was critical. The retreat was in full swing, moving north toward the Sidang River. This river was a major natural barrier, a broad, fast-flowing stretch of water that had to be crossed if the army was to survive. There was only one bridge, a fragile iron railway bridge near the village of Mokpalin. It became the bottleneck for the entire retreating army. Thousands of vehicles, trucks, ambulances, and staff cars, along with thousands of troops and civilian refugees, converged on this single point. The dust was choking. The heat was relentless, soaring over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And all the while, the Japanese were closing in, their flanking columns racing through the jungle to cut off the bridge before the main British force could cross. The scene at the Sidang Bridge on February 22nd and 23rd was one of chaotic desperation. The bridge was prepared for demolition by the engineers, packed with explosives to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But the Japanese were closer than the British commanders realized. As the rearguard fought a desperate holding action in the jungle and rubber plantations on the east bank, the Japanese pressed hard, threatening to seize the bridge intact. The commander on the spot, Major General Jackie Smythe, faced an impossible choice. If he blew the bridge, he would save the rest of the army and prevent the Japanese from marching straight to Rangoon, but he would strand 2/3 of his own division on the wrong side of the river. If he waited, the Japanese might capture the bridge and pour across, destroying everything. In the early morning darkness of February 23, 1942, the order was given. A massive explosion ripped through the night, dropping the spans of the Sidang Bridge into the dark, churning waters below. It was a tactical necessity, but a human tragedy. On the wrong side of the river, thousands of men, British, Indian, and Gurkha soldiers, stared in horror at the twisted metal. They were trapped. What followed was a nightmare of survival. Men stripped off their boots and uniforms, abandoning their heavy equipment, their rifles, and their vehicles. They fashioned rafts out of bamboo or simply swam for their lives under machine gun fire and strafing attacks from Japanese aircraft. Many drowned, swept away by the strong current. Others were shot in the water. Those who made it to the West Bank arrived with nothing but their underwear, exhausted, demoralized, and effectively disarmed. The army in Burma had been shattered. With the line at the Sidang broken, the fate of Rangoon was sealed. The order was given to evacuate the city. The authorities initiated a scorched earth policy to deny the invading Japanese the prize they sought, the oil refineries and the port facilities. As the last ships pulled away and the final rearguard convoys headed north, the sky turned black with smoke. The oil tanks were blown, sending pillars of flame thousands of feet into the air. The destruction was so vast that the smoke blotted out the sun for miles. The city of Rangoon, once a bustling colonial hub, was left as a burning shell, looted by the desperate and the opportunistic before the Japanese marched in. Now began the longest retreat in British military history, a trek of nearly 1,000 miles from Rangoon to the borders of India. The army was now under the command of a new general, William Slim. He was a man of distinct character, with a lantern jaw and a no-nonsense demeanor, a soldier who had risen from the ranks and understood the common infantryman. But even Slim could not perform miracles. He took command of a broken force, now designated as the Burma Corps or Burr Corps. His task was not to win, but to save what could be saved. He had to conduct a fighting withdrawal, holding the Japanese back just long enough to get his men, and the thousands of civilian refugees fleeing with them, across the mountains and into India before the monsoon rains arrived. The retreat northwards was a slow, grinding agony. The army was moving against the grain of the country. They were moving from the developed south into the wild, undeveloped north. As they moved, the infrastructure evaporated. Paved roads turned to dirt tracks, and dirt tracks turned to animal paths. Vehicles broke down and were pushed off the road. Fuel became scarce. Water was even scarcer. The heat in the central plains of Burma in April and May is intense, a dry, dusty heat that cracks the skin and swells the tongue. Men marched until they fainted, then got up and marched again. They were harassed constantly by Japanese aircraft, the Zero fighters and bombers that ruled the sky unopposed. The Royal Air Force and the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, had fought valiantly, but they had been overwhelmed and forced to withdraw their bases to China or India. The soldiers on the ground were naked to the sky, but the Japanese were not the only enemy. As the retreat moved into the jungle-covered hills, the environment began to take its toll. This was the domain of the mosquito. Malaria was rampant. It did not strike like a bullet. It crept up on a man, starting with a headache and a fever, shaking his body with chills until he could no longer stand. There was also dysentery, caused by bad water and poor sanitation. Men were turning into skeletons, their uniforms hanging loosely on their frames. They marched with the 1,000-yard stare, focusing only on the boots of the man in front of them. General Slim's strategy during this retreat was a lesson in cold, hard logic. He knew he could not stop the Japanese indefinitely. They were too fast, too aggressive, and his own men were too exhausted. He had to trade space for time. He fought delay actions, setting up ambushes at river crossings or narrow passes, forcing the Japanese to deploy and fight, bleeding them, and then slipping away before his own forces could be pinned down. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse. At the oil fields of Yeningyong, the British forces were almost encircled again. They were saved only by a desperate counterattack involving Chinese troops who had come down to assist, and a breakout that saw tanks smashing through Japanese roadblocks, crushing the burning debris under their tracks. The relationship between the British and the Chinese forces in Burma was complicated. The Chinese nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, had sent armies to help defend the supply lines to his country. These soldiers were tough, accustomed to hardship, but they lacked heavy weapons and logistical support. Communications between the British and Chinese commanders were often fraught with mistrust and language barriers. Yet in the chaos of the retreat, there were moments of cooperation born of sheer necessity. But as the cohesion of the defense fell apart, the retreat fragmented. The Chinese pulled back toward China, and the British pulled back toward India. By May 1942, the race was no longer just against the Japanese. It was against the weather. The monsoon in this part of the world is not just rain, it is a climatic event. It is a deluge that turns the world to mud. If the army was caught in the valleys and the lowlands when the rain started, the dirt tracks would become impassable quagmires. Vehicles would sink to their axles. Rivers would rise 20 feet in a night, sweeping away bridges and ferries. Disease would explode. Slim pushed his men harder. Keep walking was the mantra. If you stop, you die. The final stage of the retreat involved crossing the Chindwin River and climbing the steep, jungle-covered escarpments of the Naga Hills and the Chin Hills that formed the border with India. This was the most brutal terrain yet. The tracks were so narrow that vehicles had to be abandoned. It became a foot slog. Thousands of civilian refugees were mixed in with the soldiers, families carrying their entire lives in bundles on their heads, children crying, the elderly collapsing by the side of the trail. The path was lined with the debris of a fallen society. Abandoned cars, suitcases, typewriters, and tragically, the bodies of those who could go no further. Cholera broke out among the refugees, turning the trails into corridors of death. The soldiers, hardened by months of fighting, tried to help where they could, but they were barely surviving themselves. They were starving. Rations had run out days ago. Men were eating bamboo shoots, monkeys, or anything they could scavenge. Discipline, however, largely held. This was a testament to the leadership of the officers and the non-commissioned officers who kept the units together. They marched in sections, carrying their rifles even when they were too weak to shoulder them. They knew that to lose their weapon was to lose their soldierly identity, and perhaps their last shred of dignity. As the first heavy rains of the monsoon began to fall in late May, the ragged remnants of the army began to trickle into the Indian state of Manipur, specifically into the Imphal plain. They were a ghostly sight. General Slim himself arrived looking like a scarecrow, his uniform tattered, but his spirit unbroken. He later wrote about this moment, noting that they had been beaten, soundly and thoroughly. There was no point in denying it. The Japanese had outmaneuvered them, outfought them, and driven them out of Burma. But, and this was the crucial point, they had brought their weapons out. They had remained a formation. They were not a rabble. They were an army that had lost a campaign, but had survived to fight another day. The arrival in India marked the end of the beginning. The Japanese halted their pursuit at the Chindwin River. They too were exhausted, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and they had no desire to push into the difficult terrain of India during the monsoon. The rains brought a natural pause to the major combat operations. The green curtain of the jungle descended between the two armies. But the war did not stop. It merely changed its nature. Now the challenge shifted from combat to survival and preparation. The British and Indian forces had to hold the frontier. The terrain they now occupied was some of the most inhospitable on Earth. The Naga Hills and the Arakan Ranges were covered in primary jungle, a dense, multi-layered canopy that blocked out the sun. Underneath was a tangle of vines, creepers, and giant ferns. The humidity was oppressive, often nearing 100%. Clothes never dried, they just rotted on your body. Leather equipment turned green with mold overnight. Metal rusted within hours, if not constantly oiled. For the soldier on the front line, now dug into foxholes overlooking the Japanese positions across the valleys, life was a daily battle against misery. The leech was a constant companion. These tiny creatures would drop from the leaves or crawl up from the mud, attaching themselves silently to any patch of exposed skin. Soldiers would wake up to find their socks soaked in blood. Burning them off with a cigarette end became a nightly ritual. Then there were the jungle sores. A small scratch from a thorn or a bamboo leaf would essentially refuse to heal in the humid, bacteria-rich environment. It would fester, growing into a large, open ulcer that could eat down to the bone. But the greatest killer remained malaria. In 1942 and early 1943, for every man evacuated with a battle wound, 120 were evacuated sick. The medical infrastructure in India was overwhelmed. The supply lines to the front at Imphal and Kohima were tenuous at best. A single-track road and a railway that changed gauges, creating logistical bottlenecks. Reinforcements arriving in India were shocked by the state of the troops coming out of Burma. They looked like old men, their skin yellowed by atabrine, the anti-malaria drug, and jaundice, their eyes hollow. It was during this dark period that the myth of the Japanese Superman began to take hold. The average British or Indian soldier had seen the Japanese move through the jungle as if they were spirits. They had been surprised, flanked, and overrun time and again. Rumors spread in the camps. They said the Japanese could see in the dark. They said they could live for weeks on a handful of rice. They said they were invincible in the jungle. Morale was at rock bottom. The troops felt forgotten. The world's eyes were on Stalingrad in Russia or El Alamein in North Africa. Burma was a distant, depressing sideshow. General Slim knew that before he could retake Burma, he had to rebuild his army, not just physically but psychologically. He had to shatter the myth of the Japanese Superman. He began a rigorous training program. He sent his units into the jungle not to fight, but to live. He made them patrol for days, learning to navigate, learning to cook without smoke, learning the sounds of the forest. He taught them that the jungle was neutral. It was not on the side of the Japanese. It was hard on everyone, but if you mastered it, it could cover you just as well as it covered the enemy. He emphasized aggressive patrolling. Go out and find them, he ordered. Don't wait for them to come to you. While Slim rebuilt the main army, another idea was taking shape, one that would capture the imagination of the public and the high command. It was the brainchild of Orde Wingate, an eccentric, intense, and somewhat unstable British officer who had made a name for himself leading irregular forces in Ethiopia. Wingate believed that the Japanese could be beaten at their own game. He proposed long-range penetration groups, columns of highly trained infantry that would march deep behind Japanese lines, supplied entirely by air. They would blow up railways, ambush convoys, and sow chaos in the enemy rear, proving that the British soldier could operate in the jungle just as well as the Japanese. These men would come to be known as the Chindits. Wingate's theories were controversial. Many conventional commanders thought they were a waste of resources. But in the desperate atmosphere of late 1942, with no victories to show, the leadership was willing to try anything. Volunteers were called for. They were trained in the central Indian jungles, pushed to the limits of physical endurance. They learned to handle mules, which would carry their heavy radios and mortars. They learned to march with 60-pound packs in the heat. They were preparing for a mission from which many would not return. Meanwhile, on the Arakan coast, the southern part of the front, the British attempted a limited offensive in late 1942 to retake the Akyab Island airfields. It was a disaster. The troops, still road-bound and using conventional tactics, ran into heavily fortified Japanese bunker complexes. The Japanese had mastered the art of defensive jungle warfare. They dug deep, covering their bunkers with logs and earth that could withstand artillery fire. They created interlocking fields of fire, where machine guns covered every approach. The British attacks were mowed down. The offensive stalled and then, true to form, the Japanese counter-attacked, flanking the British and forcing another humiliating retreat. This failure in the Arakan reinforced the gloom. It seemed the British still hadn't learned. But in the north, the preparations continued. The 14th Army was being born. It was becoming a truly multinational force. There were Gurkhas from Nepal, fearless and skilled with the kukri knife. There were Sikhs, Punjabis, and Baluchis from India. There were East African and West African divisions, bringing their own experience of bush warfare. There were British county regiments. It was a polyglot army, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping different gods but united by a common purpose and a growing respect for their commander, Uncle Bill Slim. The logistical challenge of supporting this army was immense. The Americans were flying supplies over the hump, the Himalayas, to China, and they were also building the Lido Road, a massive engineering project intended to link India to China through northern Burma. The road was being carved out of the jungle mud by thousands of laborers and engineers, fighting landslides and rain every inch of the way. It was a testament to industrial might battling primitive geography. As 1943 dawned, the stage was set for a new phase of the war. The jungle was no longer a mystery, it was a known adversary. The soldiers knew the sounds of the night. They knew to shake out their boots for scorpions. They knew the distinctive crack of the Japanese Arisaka rifle. They were hardening. The Japanese, meanwhile, were also preparing. They were not content to sit on the Chindwan. Their commanders were dreaming of a march on Delhi, a march on India that would incite a revolution against British rule and knock India out of the war. The silence of the jungle was about to be broken again, not by the chaotic retreat of a beaten force, but by the clash of two massive armies, both believing they were the masters of the Green Hell. The coming battles would be fought at close quarters, with bayonets and grenades, in tennis courts and administrative bungalows, in the most intense hand-to-hand combat of the war. But before that, the Chindits would step off into the unknown, walking into the heart of the Japanese occupation to prove that the jungle belonged to no one. The waiting was almost over. The men checked their rifles, oiled the bolts, and looked east toward the purple hills of Burma. The memory of the long retreat was still fresh, a bitter taste in their mouths. They wanted to go back, not for glory, but to finish what had started on that dusty road to Rangoon. They wanted to go home, and the only way home was through the Japanese army. February 1943. The mist clung to the surface of the Chindwan River, a ghostly veil that obscured the far bank. On the western side, 3,000 men stood ready. They were a strange assortment, bearded, unkempt, wearing bush hats and heavily laden with packs, rifles, and ammunition bandoliers. Alongside them stood 1,000 mules, twitching their ears against the insects, their panniers loaded with radios, mortars, and explosives. This was the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, better known as the Chindits, and they were about to do something that had not been done since the retreat began. They were walking east, back into the Japanese-occupied jungle, with no intention of holding ground. Their mission was to slice into the enemy's nervous system, to cut railway lines, blow up bridges, and create chaos. Brigadier Ord Wingate moved among them. He was a man of intense, almost manic energy, often carrying a Bible and quoting scripture, wearing an alarm clock on his wrist. He told them that they were entering the unknown, that there would be no supply lines, no trucks bringing up hot food, and no hospitals for the wounded. They would be fed from the sky. The Royal Air Force would drop supplies to them in the jungle clearings. If a man was wounded and could not walk, he would have to be left behind. It was a brutal calculus, but in the deep jungle, mobility was life. They crossed the river in silence, slipping into the teak forests on the other side. For weeks, the Japanese did not know they were there. The columns moved in single file, snake-like, disappearing into the bamboo. When they struck, it was sudden. Charges were set on the vital railway line running north to Myitkyina. With a roar that shook the canopy, bridges collapsed into ravines and tracks twisted into useless metal sculptures. The Japanese rear area, previously a safe haven, was suddenly a zone of fear. Convoys were ambushed, outposts were overrun. The Japanese high command was baffled. They scrambled to find these ghosts, diverting troops from the front line to hunt them down. But the jungle began to exact its price on the Chindits. The terrain was merciless. They marched over razor-backed ridges, hacking their way through elephant grass that stood 10 feet tall and cut like a knife. The heat was stifling. Water was always a problem. Even when they found a stream, it had to be sterilized or boiled, otherwise dysentery would ravage the unit within days. And the Japanese were closing in. They realized that these columns were dependent on airdrops. They began to ambush the drop zones, or simply wait at the few water sources in the dry hills. By late March, the operation had achieved its objectives, but the Chindits were exhausted. They were starving, many suffering from malaria and jungle ulcers. Wingate gave the order to disperse and return to India in small groups. The retreat back was a horror story of survival. Men who could no longer walk asked their comrades to leave them a rifle and a few rounds of ammunition, shaking hands and waiting alone in the dark for the end. Of the 3,000 men who went in, only 2,000 returned. Most were so emaciated they could not be recognized by their own families. They looked like specters, their eyes sunken, their bodies ravaged by disease. Militarily, the first Chindit expedition was a strategic failure. The damage they did to the railway was repaired by the Japanese within weeks. The casualties were unsustainably high, but psychologically, it was a thunderclap. For the first time, British and Indian troops had met the Japanese in the deep jungle and had not run. They had outmaneuvered them. They had proven that the jungle was not the exclusive property of the enemy. When the survivors stumbled back into Imphal, their stories spread like wildfire through the 14th Army. "We went in, we slapped them, and we came out," they said. The myth of the Japanese Superman began to crack. If these men could do it, then the main army, with its tanks and artillery, could do it too. While the Chindits were recovering, General Slim was busy transforming the 14th Army. He focused on 3 things: health, supply, and morale. He introduced aggressive anti-malaria discipline. Officers were held responsible if their men got sick. He improved the diet, ensuring fresh meat and vegetables reached the front. And he drilled a new tactical doctrine into every soldier, the concept of the box. Slim knew that the Japanese tactic of the hook, encircling a unit and cutting its supply line, relied on the British unit panicking and retreating. So Slim changed the rules. The new order was simple: if you are surrounded, do not retreat. Dig in, form a defensive box, a tight perimeter with all-round defense. The enemy will surround you, yes, but they cannot stay there forever. We will supply you by air. We will drop ammunition, food, and water right into your box. You will become the anvil, and the relief forces pushing through the Japanese lines will be the hammer. The Japanese will be crushed between them. This theory was put to the ultimate test in the Arakan, the coastal province of Burma, in early 1944. The British 15th Corps began a cautious advance south. The Japanese, observing this, launched a massive counter-offensive, codenamed Ha-Go. Their plan was a classic repetition of 1942. A strong Japanese force, moving with incredible speed through the jungle, infiltrated through the British lines, bypassing the combat units and aiming straight for the administrative rear areas. They intended to panic the British, cut their retreat, and destroy them. In February 1944, the Japanese struck the 7th Indian Division. 7,000 Japanese soldiers appeared out of the mist, overrunning the divisional headquarters and cutting the Ngakiadok Pass, the only road over the Mayu Range. The 7th Division was completely surrounded. In 1942, this would have been the signal for a disastrous retreat. But this was 1944. The commander of the 7th Division, General Frank Messervy, following Slim's doctrine, issued the order, "Stand fast." The administrative troops, clerks, cooks, signalers, and muleteers found themselves on the front line. They dug in at a place called Sinzwaya, a small, dusty bowl surrounded by jungle-covered hills. It became known as the admin box. The Japanese looked down from the hills, confident that the British would surrender or rout. They launched wave after wave of attacks. They charged with bayonets, screaming "Banzai," into the teeth of the British machine guns. Inside the admin box, chaos was organized into defense. Tanks, the American-made Lee Grants, which the Japanese thought could not operate in the jungle, were used as mobile pillboxes. Their 37mm and 75mm guns blasted the Japanese bunkers on the hillsides. The clerks dropped their pens and picked up rifles. The mule drivers fought beside the Gurkhas. The fighting was savage. At one point, Japanese troops broke into the field hospital. They murdered the doctors and the wounded in their stretchers, a war crime that sent a ripple of cold fury through the defenders. There would be no surrender now. It was kill or be killed. For 3 weeks the battle raged. The Japanese were bewildered. Why weren't the British running? Why were they fighting so hard? The answer came from the sky. Every day, Dakota transport planes and Spitfire fighters flew over the admin box. The Spitfires chased the Japanese aircraft from the sky, achieving total air superiority. Then the Dakotas came in low, dropping tons of supplies on parachutes. Ammunition, medical supplies, cigarettes, and even newspapers drifted down into the besieged bowl. The defenders were getting stronger while the attackers, cut off from their own supplies and living in the jungle without shelter, were starving. The Japanese had brought only enough food for 10 days, expecting to capture British rations. Now they were eating roots and lizards. They were running out of ammunition. The hunter had become the trapped. British relief columns, the 5th and 26th Indian Divisions, began to smash through the Japanese roadblocks from the north and west. The hammer was falling on the anvil. By late February, the Japanese offensive in the Arakan had collapsed. It was the first major British victory of the Burma Campaign. The psychological impact was immense. The spell was broken. The soldiers of the 14th Army looked at each other and realized the truth. The Japanese could be stopped. They could be killed. And when their tactics failed, they did not know what to do. The Japanese commander, Hanaya, refusing to admit defeat, ordered his starving men to continue attacks that were essentially suicide. Thousands died needlessly. Far to the north, watching these events unfold, was Lieutenant General Riniam Mutaguchi, the commander of the Japanese 15th Army. He was a man of boundless ambition and arrogance, a samurai of the old school who believed that spirit could overcome matter. He dismissed the failure in the Arakan as a minor setback. His eyes were fixed on a much larger prize, Imphal and Kohima. Mutaguchi had conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity, codenamed U-Go. He proposed to throw 3 entire divisions, over 100,000 men, across the Chindwan River, through the impossible terrain of the jungle mountains to seize the Imphal plain in India. Once Imphal was taken, he would control the massive British supply dumps. From there, he would push to the Brahmaputra Valley, cutting the supply line to China and threatening the whole of British India. His own superiors were skeptical. The logistics were a nightmare. How would he feed such a massive army in the jungle? There were no roads for trucks. Mutaguchi's answer was Genghis Khan tactics. He would take the food on the hoof. He ordered the procurement of thousands of oxen, cattle, and elephants to accompany the troops, carrying supplies and eventually serving as meat. He ignored the warnings of his supply officers. The Japanese soldier, he declared, can march on nothing but his fighting spirit. In March 1944, the storm broke. The Japanese 15th Army began to cross the Chindwin River on a broad front. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight. Thousands of soldiers, hardened veterans of China and Singapore, moved with a singular purpose. They moved fast, ignoring the British outposts, flowing around them like water. They were racing against the clock, aiming to capture the British supplies at Imphal before their own meager rations ran out. General Slim had expected an attack, but the ferocity and speed of the Japanese advance surprised him. He had hoped to fight the battle on the Imphal plain, where his tanks and artillery would have the advantage. But he had left his forward divisions out too long. As the Japanese columns hooked around them, the British 17th Indian Division found itself fighting for its life on the road from Tiddim, trying to punch its way back to Imphal before the trap snapped shut. To the north, a smaller Japanese force was heading for a hill station called Kohima. Slim and his commanders initially thought this was just a raiding party, a distraction. They were wrong. An entire Japanese division, the 31st, under the command of the brilliant General Sato, was marching through terrain that the British had considered impassable, hauling mountain guns up goat tracks. Their target was the ridge at Kohima, the gateway to the Dimapur railhead. If Kohima fell, the road to the rest of India lay open. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles of the Second World War, the Battle of Imphal in Kohima. It would be fought in the steep, jungle-covered hills, in the pouring rain of the monsoon, and in the flower gardens of the district commissioner's bungalow. As the Japanese closed the ring around Imphal, cutting the road to the north, the 14th Army was once again isolated. Over 100,000 British and Indian troops, along with thousands of civilians, were trapped in the Imphal plain. The only way in or out was by air. It was a siege on a massive scale. Inside the perimeter, the tension was palpable. The soldiers dug their trenches deeper. They strung barbed wire until their hands were raw. They knew that this was the decisive moment. If they held, the Japanese army would be destroyed. If they failed, India would be invaded. At Kohima, a small garrison of about 1,500 men, a mix of the Royal West Kents, Assam Rifles, and administrative troops, found themselves facing 15,000 Japanese soldiers. They were dug in on a series of ridges, Garrison Hill, Jail Hill, and Detail Hill. The Japanese attacked on the night of April 4, 1944. The darkness erupted with mortar fire and the screams of charging infantry. The siege of Kohima had begun. The Japanese swarmed up the slopes, indifferent to losses. The British defenders fired until their barrels glowed red-hot. The perimeter shrank night by night. The water supply was cut. The medical bunker was overflowing with wounded men who could not be evacuated. The air was thick with the smell of death and cordite. On the Imphal front, the battles were equally ferocious. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at the Shenam Saddle and the Nungshigam summit. At Nungshigam, a vital hill overlooking the main airfield, the Japanese captured the crest. If they held it, their artillery could destroy the aircraft that were the lifeline of the garrison. Slim knew he had to take it back. He sent in the tanks. It was considered impossible to use tanks on such steep slopes. The gradients were 1 and 2. But the crews of the Carabiniers, riding their Lee Grant tanks, gunned their engines and clawed their way up the hillside, slipping and sliding in the mud. The infantry, Dogras and Gurkhas, walked up beside them. As the tanks crested the ridge, they came face to face with the Japanese dug in on the reverse slope. The engagement was fought at a range of 10 yards. The tanks blasted the bunkers point blank, while Japanese soldiers climbed onto the hulls to push grenades through the vision slits. It was a scene of medieval savagery fought with modern machines. The hill was retaken, but the cost was terrible. Every officer in the attacking tank squadron was killed or wounded. By mid-April 1944, the situation was critical. At Kohima, the garrison had been forced back to a single hill. The Japanese had captured the district commissioner's bungalow and were digging in on one side of the tennis court. The British were dug in on the other side. The distance between them was the width of a tennis court. For weeks, they threw grenades at each other over the net. Snipers waited for a helmet to show a fraction of an inch. It was a stalemate of exhaustion. But time was on Slim's side. The monsoon was approaching. The sky was turning a bruised purple, and the first heavy drops of rain were falling. For the Japanese, the rain was a death sentence. Their supply lines, already thin, would dissolve into mud. The cattle they had brought were dying or had been eaten. Disease was rampant in their foxholes. They were running out of bullets. General Sato, commanding the Japanese division at Kohima, radioed Mutaguchi in desperation. "Troops are starving," he reported. "Request permission to withdraw." Mutaguchi, sitting in his headquarters safely behind the lines, was furious. He ordered Sato to stay and fight to the death. "Go and eat grass," was the message sent back to the starving men. But the British and Indian troops were not starving. The airlift was working. Hundreds of Dakota aircraft flew through the mountain passes every day, dodging storms and Japanese fighters, to land at Imphal or drop supplies at Kohima. They brought in 2 entire divisions of reinforcements, flying them straight from the Arakan front into the besieged plain. It was a miracle of logistics. The Japanese watched from the hills with envy and despair as the British grew stronger every day. The turning of the tide was slow, grinding, and bloody. It was not a sudden breakthrough, but a gradual crushing of the Japanese offensive power. The British began to push out from the admin box at Kohima, inch by inch, bunker by bunker. Tanks were winched up the hillsides to blast the Japanese out of their holes. Flamethrowers were used to clear the deep dugouts. In June, the monsoon broke in full fury. The roads turned into rivers of mud. The trenches filled with water. But the British kept pushing. On June 22, 1944, the leading tanks of the British 2nd Division, pushing down from Dimapur, met the forward troops of the 7th Indian Division pushing up from Imphal. The handshakes at milestone 109 on the Imphal Road marked the end of the siege. The road was open. The Japanese had been defeated, but the killing was not over. The Japanese 15th Army was shattered, but it had not yet been destroyed. Mutaguchi finally gave the order to retreat in July. It was too late. His army was a skeleton. The retreat back to the Chindwan would be a march of death that would eclipse even the British retreat of 1942. The Japanese soldiers, starving, riddled with malaria and dysentery, began to stagger back toward the river. They abandoned their equipment. They abandoned their wounded. The trails were lined with corpses. British patrols following them reported a stench that hung over the jungle for miles, the smell of thousands of unburied bodies rotting in the monsoon heat. It was the greatest defeat in Japanese military history to date. Of the 100,000 men who had marched on India, over 50,000 lay dead in the jungle. For the soldiers of the 14th Army, this was the moment of vindication. They had stood their ground. They had beaten the invincible enemy at his own game. They had fought through the fear, the disease, and the monsoon, and they had won. They were no longer the forgotten army. They were a finely tuned fighting machine, confident and aggressive. General Slim did not let them rest. He knew that he had the Japanese on the run. He intended to pursue them relentlessly, to give them no time to recover, to drive them not just back to the Chindwan but across it and into the heart of Burma itself. The road to Mandalay was open, but before the pursuit could begin in earnest, the army had to deal with the aftermath of the battle. The cleanup at Kohima and Imphal revealed the horror of the Japanese desperation. Diaries found on dead bodies spoke of soldiers eating worms, of officers committing suicide rather than facing the shame of defeat. It was a grim reminder of the fanaticism of the enemy they were fighting. As the rains began to ease in late 1944, the 14th Army stood poised on the threshold of a great offensive. They had new weapons, new tactics, and a new spirit. The jungle, once a place of terror, was now their element. They had learned to live in it, fight in it, and win in it. The next phase of the campaign would take them out of the mountains and into the central plains of Burma. It would be a different kind of war, a war of movement, of tank battles in the open dust, of crossing great rivers under fire. It would be the race for Rangoon. The soldiers looked at their maps. The names were legendary: Mandalay, Meiktila, the Irrawaddy. They were going back, and this time they were not going to stop until they reached the sea. The rains of 1944 finally receded, leaving the earth steaming and the rivers swollen, but the 14th Army did not stop. General Slim knew that momentum was a perishable commodity. The Japanese 15th Army was broken, staggering back toward the safety of the Irrawaddy River, but a wounded animal is often the most dangerous. The pursuit to the Chindwan was a feat of engineering as much as fighting. As the mud dried into hard, rutted ruts, the engineers pushed roads forward, laying down Bailey bridges over the chaotic torrents, ensuring that the trucks carrying the lifeblood of the army, fuel and ammunition, could keep pace with the infantry. By December 1944, the leading elements of the British forces had reached the banks of the Chindwan. To the soldiers who had crossed this river in the other direction during the humiliation of 1942, this was a symbolic moment. They were back, but the river was wide, a dark, sluggish expanse of water that marked the boundary between the jungle mountains they had conquered and the central plains of Burma that lay ahead. The terrain was changing. As the army pushed east and south, the claustrophobic walls of the jungle began to fall away. They were entering the dry belt of central Burma. Here the teak forests gave way to scrub brush, cactus, and dry, dusty fields. The visibility opened up from yards to miles. For the tank crews, this was liberation. No longer confined to narrow tracks where they were easy prey for ambushers, they could now fan out, using their speed and firepower in the open. But the open ground brought new dangers. The sun beat down with a ferocity that turned the inside of a Sherman tank into an oven. The dust, fine and red, coated everything, clogging filters, jamming machine guns, and filling the lungs of the marching men. General Slim now devised a plan that would go down in military history as a masterpiece of operational art. He initially planned to fight the main Japanese force on the Shwibo Plain, north of the Irrawaddy. But intelligence reports, gathered by the brave pilots of the Royal Air Force and the local scouts, revealed that the new Japanese commander, General Kimura, was too smart for that. Kimura had withdrawn his main strength behind the massive barrier of the Irrawaddy River, hoping to use it as a moat. He planned to let the British stretch their supply lines to the breaking point, cross the river, and then counter-attack them while they were vulnerable on the beaches. Slim read the battlefield and changed his mind. He decided to play a game of high-stakes deception. He would keep the Japanese attention fixed on Mandalay in the north, making them believe the main attack would come there. He would use the 33rd Corps to make a loud, aggressive advance toward Mandalay, seizing bridgeheads and drawing the Japanese reserves north. Meanwhile, in total radio silence, he would send his striking force, the 4th Corps, on a long, circuitous march through the Gangaw Valley to the south. Their objective was not Mandalay, but Meiktila. Meiktila was the heart of the Japanese supply system in Burma. It was the hub where the railways and roads intersected, the site of the main airfields and supply dumps. If Slim could seize Meiktila, he would sever the jugular vein of the Japanese army in the north. They would be cut off from their base, with no ammunition, no fuel, and no way home. But to get there, the 4th Corps had to move over 300 miles through rough tracks, cross the Irrawaddy where it was miles wide, and strike deep into enemy territory, all without being detected. The deception plan, code-named Operation Cloak, was elaborate. A dummy corps headquarters was set up to simulate radio traffic, convincing the Japanese eavesdroppers that the Fourth Corps was still in the north. A dummy parachute drop was staged, using burlap sacks filled with sand to look like paratroopers, to draw enemy eyes away from the south. And silently, thousands of men and hundreds of tanks began the long drive through the dust of the Gango Valley. In January 1945, the operation began. The 33rd Corps swung into action in the north, crossing the Irrawaddy north and west of Mandalay. The fighting was fierce. The Japanese defended the riverbanks with suicidal tenacity. They had dug deep bunkers into the dikes and levees, creating overlapping fields of fire. The British and Indian troops had to cross in canvas boats, paddling through mortar barrages and machine gun fire. The water turned red, but they established their footholds, and the Japanese commander Kimura took the bait. Convinced this was the main thrust, he poured his reserves north to crush the bridgeheads. While the attention was fixed on Mandalay, the Fourth Corps arrived at the Irrawaddy far to the south, near the town of Pakaku. It was mid-February 1945. The river here was vast, a shimmering expanse of water over 2 miles wide in places, dotted with sandbars and islands. The crossing was a logistical nightmare. They did not have enough landing craft. The engineers, working with miraculous ingenuity, built rafts from local timber and oil drums. They waterproofed trucks and tanks. On the night of February 13th, the crossing began. The first wave went in silence, drifting with the current. But the silence was broken by the sputter of an outboard motor, then the crack of a Japanese sentry's rifle. The far bank erupted in fire, but the Japanese presence here was thin. They had not expected an attack this far south. The British pushed through, securing a beachhead. Now came the race. The engineers worked feverishly to build a floating bridge, the longest operational Bailey Bridge in the world at the time. Over this swaying ribbon of steel, the heavy armor of the 17th Indian Division poured across the river. Once across, they did not stop to consolidate. They drove for Maktila, 80 miles to the east. It was a blitzkrieg in the Asian sun. The armored columns roared across the dry plains, raising plumes of dust that could be seen for 20 miles. They bypassed resistance, crushing roadblocks and leaving the Japanese rear guards confused and isolated. The speed was intoxicating. For years, the army had measured its advance in yards per day. Now they were covering miles in an hour. On February 26th, the strike force reached the outskirts of Maktila. The Japanese were stunned. They were cooking their rice, servicing their aircraft, and organizing their warehouses, completely unaware that a hostile armored division was at their gates. But the Japanese garrison, though surprised, was not helpless. Maktila was defended by a motley collection of airfield defense troops, administrative personnel, and hospital patients, hastily organized into suicide squads. They fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed. The Battle of Maktila was savage. It was fought in the streets, among the pagodas, and across the open runways of the airfields. The Japanese used aerial bombs buried in the roads as mines, blowing tracks off the Sherman tanks. They crouched in foxholes with satchel charges, waiting to throw themselves under the treads of the advancing armor. The British infantry had to clear the town house by house. It was a battle of extermination. The lakes in the center of the town, usually serene and dotted with lilies, became graveyards. By early March, Maktila was in British hands. The supply dumps were captured or destroyed. The airfields were secured, and almost immediately, American transport planes began landing, bringing in reinforcements and flying out the wounded. The trap had snapped shut. General Kimura, realizing too late what had happened, turned his army around. He stopped his attacks on the northern bridgeheads and threw everything he had at Maktila, trying to retake the vital hub. Now the tables were turned. The British were the ones in the box, defending Maktila against frantic Japanese counterattacks. But this time, the Japanese were the ones running out of supplies. They threw themselves against the British perimeter night after night, but the Fourth Corps, supplied by air and supported by tanks, held firm. The Japanese 15th and 33rd Armies were being ground to dust between the anvil of Meiktila and the hammer of the 33rd Corps pushing down from the north. In the north, the road to Mandalay was now open. The 19th Indian Division, known as the Dagger Division, raced toward the ancient capital. Mandalay was a city of legends, dominated by Mandalay Hill, a ridge covered in temples and pagodas that overlooked the sprawling city and the massive walls of Fort Dufferin. The hill had to be taken first. The assault on Mandalay Hill in March 1945 was a vertical battle. The Gurkhas and British infantry fought their way up the steep steps, clearing the Japanese from the pagodas and shrines. It was close-quarters combat in a holy place. Grenades were rolled down stairwells. Machine guns were set up behind statues of the Buddha. From the summit, the soldiers could look down into the square mile of Fort Dufferin, surrounded by a wide moat and high brick walls. The Japanese held the fort. It was a formidable, medieval fortress. The walls were 20 feet high and thick enough to withstand field artillery. The British brought up medium guns and fired point-blank at the walls, but the bricks simply absorbed the impact. They tried skip bombing with aircraft, bouncing bombs off the water of the moat into the walls. Nothing seemed to work. The siege of Fort Dufferin dragged on, a strange anachronism in a modern war. Finally, on March 20th, as the British prepared for a massive assault, a group of Anglo-Burmese locals waved a white flag from the gate. The Japanese had slipped away in the night, escaping through the drains and the southern gates. The British soldiers marched into the fort, raising the Union Jack over the battering ramparts. Mandalay, the symbol of British rule in Upper Burma, had been retaken. With Mandalay and Meiktila in British hands, the Japanese army in Burma effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. They had lost their supplies, their command structure was shattering, and their soldiers were starving and demoralized. The road to the south, to Rangoon, lay open, but now a new enemy appeared, the calendar. It was April 1945. The monsoon was due in May. If the British did not reach Rangoon before the rains came, the dry plains would turn to mud, the advance would bog down, and the Japanese would have months to rebuild their defenses around the port city. It became a race against the weather. General Slim issued a simple order: on to Rangoon. He ignored his flanks. He organized his forces into mechanized columns, stripping them of all non-essential equipment to save weight and fuel. They drove down the main road and the railway corridor, bypassing Japanese strongpoints. If a village was held by the enemy, they called in an airstrike and drove around it. They were covering 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles a day. It was a chaotic advance. The retreating Japanese were mixed in with the advancing British. Tanks would often find themselves sharing the road with Japanese trucks heading in the same direction, leading to sudden, violent firefights. The British pilots flew constant sorties, strafing the retreating Japanese columns, turning the roads into corridors of burning wreckage. The heat was intense, the dust choking, but the adrenaline of the chase kept the men going. They sensed the end was near. As they pushed south, they encountered a new tragedy. The Japanese, in their retreat, had forced thousands of civilians to march with them, or had simply looted and burned the villages they passed through. The British troops were greeted as liberators. Villagers would come out to the road, offering water and fruit to the dusty men in the tanks, cheering them on. By late April, the leading tanks were at Pegu, only 50 miles from Rangoon. But here, the Japanese made a final stand. They blew the bridges and dug in, desperate to hold the road just long enough for the rains to start. And then the weather broke. On May 1st, the sky turned black, and a torrential downpour unleashed itself on the waiting armies. The dust turned to soup. The tanks began to slide. The advance slowed to a crawl. The soldiers looked at the sky and cursed. They were so close. Slim, anticipating that the overland advance might be slowed by the rain, had prepared a backup plan: an amphibious assault on Rangoon, codenamed Operation Dracula. On May 1, 1945, while the tanks were stuck in the mud at Pegu, a composite battalion of Gurkha paratroopers dropped at Elephant Point, at the mouth of the Rangoon River. Their job was to clear the Japanese coastal batteries to allow the minesweepers and landing craft to enter the harbor. The drop was successful. The Gurkhas, tough and efficient, silenced the guns. The next day, the landing craft moved up the river. They expected a bloodbath. Rangoon was a large city, easily defensible. They braced themselves for house-to-house fighting. But as the first boats approached the docks on May 3rd, they saw something strange. There was no gunfire, no artillery shells splashing in the water. Instead, they saw a message painted on the roof of the jail in large white letters. "Japs gone." Extract digit, a crude British soldier slang meaning "hurry up." The Japanese had evacuated the city days before. The prompt collapse of their army in the north had made Rangoon untenable. They had fled east toward the Thai border, leaving the city open. The British troops landed on the docks to find a ghost town, looted and damaged, but free. The race was over. They had beaten the rain by a matter of hours. On May 6th, the troops of the Overland Advance, having finally extricated themselves from the mud of Pegu, linked up with the amphibious forces north of Rangoon. The handshake between the tank commanders from the north and the Marines from the south marked the final liberation of Burma. The campaign was technically over, but the war was not. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were still trapped in the jungle west of the Irrawaddy. Cut off from their retreat, starving and desperate, they tried to break out in July 1945 to reach the tenuous safety of the East. This final battle, known as the Battle of the Breakout, was a slaughter. The British, forewarned by captured plans and waiting in prepared positions, mowed them down as they tried to cross the swollen Sidang River. It was the final, tragic act of a tragedy that had lasted 3 years. The Burma Campaign was one of the most grueling in history. It was fought in the worst terrain, under the worst weather conditions, against a fanatical enemy. It was a war of logistics, of medicine, and of engineering as much as it was a war of bullets. It was the forgotten war to the public back home, who were focused on D-Day and the fall of Berlin. But for the men who fought there, the British, the Indians, the Gurkhas, the West Africans, the Americans, and the Chinese, it was a universe unto itself. They had started as a beaten, demoralized force, kicked out of the country in 1942. They had rebuilt themselves in the mountains of India. They had learned to master the jungle. And then they had returned, walking back over the bones of their comrades, to inflict upon the Japanese army the greatest defeat it had ever suffered on land. General Slim, the architect of this victory, stood in the ruins of Rangoon. He was not a man given to grand speeches. He knew the cost. He thought of the thousands of white wooden crosses back in Kohima and Imphal. He thought of the chaps who had died of typhus in the bamboo bashes. He thought of the sheer endurance of the human spirit. As the soldiers of the 14th Army finally rested, cleaning the red dust from their rifles one last time, they looked around at the land they had liberated. The pagodas still glittered in the sun. The Irrawaddy still flowed silently to the sea. The war had passed over this land like a storm, destroying much, but the land remained. And the silence, the deep, heavy silence of the jungle began to return, reclaiming the foxholes and the burnt-out tanks, wrapping the scars of war in a green embrace. The guns had fallen silent in Rangoon in May 1945, but the ripples of the Burma Campaign continued to spread long after the last shot was fired. The official end came in August, after the atomic bombs fell on Japan. For the soldiers in the Burmese jungle, the news came not as a flash of light, but as a crackle over the radio. The order was cease fire. For men who had spent years learning to kill on sight, the sudden peace was disorienting. They stood up in their foxholes, wary, half expecting a trick. Slowly, the Japanese soldiers emerged from the bamboo, skeletal, ragged, and defeated. The surrender ceremonies that followed were somber affairs. In Rangoon and Singapore, proud Japanese officers surrendered their ancestral samurai swords to the British commanders they had once underestimated. It was the physical dismantling of the myth of invincibility. But as the dust settled, the true cost of the campaign began to reveal itself. It was not just found in the military cemeteries at Tokien or Kohima, where thousands of white markers stood in neat rows against the tropical green. It was found in the deep jungle camps of Thailand and Burma, where the Japanese had built their infamous death railway. As the Allied forces moved in to liberate these camps, they found a horror that defied description. Tens of thousands of British, Australian, Dutch, and American prisoners of war, alongside hundreds of thousands of Asian laborers, had been worked to death. They were skin and bone, riddled with tropical ulcers, living in filth. The reunion between the victorious 14th Army and these survivors was one of the most emotional moments of the war. Hardened combat veterans wept openly at the sight of their comrades who had endured years of hell. The aftermath of the campaign also signaled a profound geopolitical shift. The British had fought to retake Burma, ostensibly to restore the colonial order. They marched back into Rangoon with the Union Jack flying high, expecting to pick up where they had left off in 1942. But the Burma they returned to was not the Burma they had left. The war had changed everything. The nationalist movement, led by General Aung San, who had initially fought for the Japanese before switching sides to the Allies, had gained immense strength. The Burmese people had seen the British defeated once. The aura of imperial permanence was shattered. They did not want a return to colonial rule. They wanted independence. General Slim, with his characteristic pragmatism, recognized this. He treated Aung San not as a subordinate, but as a partner. However, the political momentum was unstoppable. The victory in Burma became, ironically, the death knell of the British Empire in the East. The soldiers who had fought so hard to liberate the country found themselves policing a nation that was eager for them to leave. Within 3 years, in 1948, Burma would become an independent nation, and the British regiments would march to the docks of Rangoon one last time, boarding the ships to sail away from the land that had consumed so much of their blood and youth. For the soldiers of the 14th Army, the return home was a bittersweet experience. They called themselves the Forgotten Army, and the label stuck. When they arrived back in the United Kingdom, they found a country exhausted by war and focused on the rebuilding of Europe. The public knew about D-Day, they knew about the Battle of Britain, but they knew little of the Arakan, of the Chindits, or of the admin box. There were noticer tape parades for the men who had defeated the largest Japanese army on the Asian mainland. They returned to a gray, rationed Britain that simply wanted to move on. Many veterans found it difficult to adjust. They had lived for years in a world of high adrenaline, primitive survival, and intense camaraderie. They missed the jungle, even as they hated it. They missed the simplicity of life where your only worry was the man next to you and the enemy in front of you. They carried the physical and mental scars of the campaign for the rest of their lives. The recurring malaria fevers, the nightmares of the hand-to-hand fighting, the memory of the smell of the dead in the humid air. And what of the commanders? General William Slim, the architect of the victory, remains one of the most respected generals in military history, yet he was a man of immense humility. He never sought the limelight. In his memoirs, he gave all the credit to his soldiers. He eventually served as the Governor-General of Australia, a beloved figure who never forgot the men of the 14th Army. On the other side, the Japanese commander, Mutaguchi, lived out his days in shame. He was widely blamed for the disaster at Imphal, for the march of death that destroyed his army. At his funeral, in a final act of defiance or perhaps delusion, he ordered that pamphlets defending his strategy be distributed to the mourners. He went to his grave refusing to admit that he had been beaten by a better army and a better general. The legacy of the Burma Campaign is complex. It was a war of extreme contrasts, modern tanks fighting alongside war elephants, airplanes dropping supplies to men fighting with cutlass and bayonets. It was a war where the environment was as much an enemy as the opposing army. But above all, it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It proved that ordinary men, drawn from the cities of England, the villages of India, the mountains of Nepal, and the bush of Africa, could endure the unendurable and triumph. Today, if you travel to the quiet hill station of Kohima, the site of the most savage fighting, you will find a war cemetery on the slopes of Garrison Hill. It is a peaceful place now, where the wind rustles through the pine trees. At the base of a large memorial stone, there is an inscription. It is known as the Kohima Epitaph. These words, written by John Maxwell Edmonds, have become the immortal voice of the Burma veterans, a final message from the fallen to the living, echoing down through the decades. The words are simple, yet they carry the weight of the entire campaign. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." This is the end of the story of the Burma Campaign, a story of defeat, survival, and ultimate victory in the green shadows of the East.